Kensington, Chelsea District, 128 King's Road, second floor master bedroom. For Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock received a strange letter. It was strange because, logically speaking, no one would specify a recipient's address down to second floor master bedroom when sending mail. Surely no one would expect the postman to deliver a letter directly to a bedroom? Yet this letter had indeed been delivered to Sherlock's bedroom. This was the second reason it was strange. The letter's postman was an owl. Yes, an owl. Sherlock looked toward the coat rack nearby. There perched a black and white spotted eagle owl. It was this very owl that had just flown through the second-floor window carrying the envelope, circled the room once, and dropped the letter precisely into his hands. It was almost supernatural. Sherlock was naturally surprised at first. Anyone would be unsettled by such an occurrence. But unlike ordinary people, the excitement this event brought Sherlock quickly overwhelmed his surprise. Turning the envelope over, he found a dark red wax seal and a shield emblem that looked quite striking. Even more eye-catching than these, however, was a large letter H surrounded by 4 animals: a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake. Despite the envelope's limited space, the 4 animal designs weren't distorted at all. Instead, each was lifelike, as if about to leap from the paper. Sherlock retrieved a magnifying glass from his drawer and began examining it with skillful precision. His gray eyes sparkled with interest, and his slightly trembling hands showed that his inner state was far from as calm as his outer demeanor showed. Finally, Sherlock laughed aloud with delight. At last, something to lift one's spirits. The local criminals have been far too inactive lately. In 1991, as European integration accelerated, EU member states were quickening their pace in unison. Rumors suggested that the European Community would pass formal treaties for European Economic and Monetary Union and European Political Union by year's end. As one of the core member states, Britain was intensifying domestic security and stability measures to demonstrate its former imperial glory and outshine its main rivals, France and Germany. In fact, by the late 20th century, large-scale criminal organizations had virtually disappeared from mainland Britain. Only street gangs remained, stubbornly asserting their presence. Under these circumstances, London, as the capital, bore the brunt of high-pressure policing. Faced with such intense scrutiny, criminals were lying low, temporarily ceasing operations. Additionally, Sherlock had recently recovered from a serious illness, and his parents had arranged for him to attend a preparatory school. For someone like Sherlock, who thrived on excitement and despised peaceful living, this time of waiting at home for school to begin was naturally becoming increasingly tedious. Until today. Of course, despite his inner excitement, Sherlock still carefully examined the envelope before opening it. This had always been his habit. No postage stamp, emerald green ink, parchment paper, unusually thick paper. Interesting. Through observation, Sherlock had already drawn preliminary conclusions. However, he needed to examine the letter's contents for further confirmation. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Headmaster, Albus Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sorcerer, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. Dear Mr. Holmes, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on September 1st. We await your owl by no later than July 31st. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagal, Deputy Headmistress. Before reading the letter, Sherlock had considered many possibilities, but not this one. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Long list of titles. Mumbo-jumbo. So, this was an acceptance letter. The letter's content was so outrageous that even the normally rational Sherlock found himself deep in thought. As mentioned in the letter, there was indeed a second page, a list of required school supplies. At a glance, Sherlock spotted items like magic wands, spellbooks, and wizard robes, which were things that only appeared in fantasy literature and films. Books like Standard Book of Spells and A History of Magic even had authors listed. As if it were all real. After a moment of silence, Sherlock held the letter up to the light. Ha! His eyes grew brighter. If this had been any other child, they would probably already be excitedly believing everything. However, 11-year-old Sherlock Holmes was no ordinary person. He was far more mature than his peers. And he was a boy who believed unwaveringly in science. Magic. How could something that existed only in legends actually be real? So, this had to be a prank. An exquisitely crafted envelope that could be forged. The letter's contents. Anyone with a little creativity could compose such things. My address. That was the simplest part. It would take even less thought than fabricating the letter's contents. The only puzzling part was the mail-delivering owl. Sherlock had indeed never heard of owls performing such tasks before. That job typically fell to their cousins, carrier pigeons. But never having heard of it didn't mean it was impossible. With enough effort, Sherlock believed this could be accomplished. The question was, would someone really spend considerable effort on such a pointless endeavor? The answer was yes. Because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Sherlock's childhood dream had been to become a pirate. While this ambition was certainly peculiar, it wasn't entirely unacceptable. After all, it was part of their national maritime tradition. During that period, Sherlock had received a letter. Similar to this acceptance letter, though that time it had been delivered by a proper postman. The writer claimed to be Captain Jack Sparrow, saying he had once been a noble pirate who commanded many crew members, sailed the seas, and robbed the rich to help the poor, a legendary figure of his time. Unfortunately, he had been tricked by another villainous captain who stole his beloved pirate ship. Ultimately disheartened, he ended up wandering the streets. He wrote to Sherlock because he had discovered that Sherlock possessed the potential to become an excellent pirate, leading him to make a decision that went against his ancestors, to train Sherlock as his successor. The goal was to defeat the scoundrel who had stolen his ship and reclaim everything he had once possessed. Initially, Sherlock had been reluctant. But as time passed, this Captain Jack eventually proved himself to Sherlock through various means. Sherlock was no ordinary child, after all. Gaining his trust was never an easy task. Because of this, throughout the process, Sherlock had tested and verified the man multiple times, yet found no flaws as everything seemed legitimate. However, just when Sherlock finally believed the man and became determined to follow Captain Jack on adventures, he was told it had all been a hoax. This revelation was like a bolt from the blue for him. Sherlock took a deep breath. The past need not be revisited. But one cannot stumble in the same place twice. Now Sherlock's deductive and analytical abilities were stronger than in his naive childhood, and with his previous experience as a lesson, he naturally wouldn't be easily deceived again. So even though common sense told him that owls didn't deliver mail, based on his previous experience of being deceived, as long as someone was willing to invest considerable effort, training an owl to deliver mail wasn't impossible. That person took pleasure in toying with his emotions. Recalling this experience, Sherlock paced back and forth in his room. Finally, he made a decision that wasn't particularly difficult, took out a paper and began writing rapidly. Dear Professor McGonagal, I am honored to receive the acceptance letter from your school, and I would be delighted to attend your institution for my studies. However, neither I nor my family have previously heard of magic matters, nor do we understand the enrollment preparations. If your school could arrange for staff to visit and answer our questions, I would be most grateful. Sherlock Holmes. A smile appeared at Sherlock's face. Since he was seeking excitement, he might as well see it through to the end. The other party had already made their move, so he would play along properly. Unexpectedly, just as Sherlock finished writing his reply, the owl still perched on the coat rack immediately hooted once and fluttered over to him. So proactive. Sherlock tentatively extended his hand, and the owl immediately took the letter in its beak and flew out the window with a beat of its wings. Watching its flight posture and speed, Sherlock couldn't help but feel impressed. Judging from this owl's training results, considerable effort had indeed been invested. This alone made it worthy of his serious attention. From his understanding of that person, they certainly wouldn't give up so easily. How would they respond to him? Would they gradually gain his trust through letters? Or would they arrange for someone to impersonate a magic school teacher? Or would they simply jump out and bluntly announce it was all a hoax? Well, that last option seemed unlikely. After all, both sides wanted to continue this contest. Regardless, Sherlock was very much looking forward to what would happen next. At least, this summer wouldn't be boring. What Sherlock hadn't expected was how quickly the response would come. 3 days after receiving the acceptance letter, Sherlock was having breakfast with his parents. Mrs. Holmes picked up the newspaper and glanced at it, then exclaimed to her husband, "Tarquin, that burglary case has been solved. Sherlock was right. The culprit really was that one-armed man." Mr. Holmes smiled and looked at his son. "I remember that was a case from 3 months ago." Sherlock put a piece of bread in his mouth and said coolly, "Scotland Yard's efficiency is always like this, and they turn a blind eye to obvious facts." Scotland Yard wasn't a place name, but rather the nickname for the London Metropolitan Police. It was neither located in Scotland nor responsible for Scotland's security. The Metropolitan Police was responsible for maintaining public order and traffic control throughout Greater London, excluding the City of London proper. Its old headquarters was located at 4 Whitehall Street. Because one of its back doors faced Scotland Yard, and this door happened to be the Metropolitan Police's public entrance, over time, Scotland Yard became the nickname for the London Metropolitan Police. Using place names to refer to institutions wasn't uncommon. Fleet Street, 10, Downing Street, for example. This habit wasn't unique to Britain. Other countries had similar practices. For instance, Sherlock, who was interested in investigation, knew of places like Lubyanka, 6 Doors, and West Icehouse Hotel. Hearing Sherlock's assessment of Scotland Yard, Mr. Holmes couldn't help but suggest, "Sherlock, perhaps you should become a detective in the future." Sherlock raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Just then, an eagle owl flew straight through the open window. Sherlock's powers of observation and memory were exceptional. He immediately recognized this as the same owl that had delivered the letter 3 days earlier. Like before, it circled the room several times and dropped a letter directly into Sherlock's hands with a sharp thwack. Mr. and Mrs. Holmes were instantly stunned. "Good Lord, Tanner, what am I seeing? An owl that delivers mail. This must be a hallucination. Oh, Holy Mary, Violet, I'll wager it's a messenger from God." Watching his wife continuously making the sign of the cross on her chest, Mr. Holmes shook his head and said, "Hey, sweetheart, you're reacting like a mad turkey. As everyone knows, God's messengers only come to earth when the end times arrive." "Damn it, how can you think that? That's such a terrible thought, just like Aunt Susan's apple pie next door. If you keep talking like that, I swear I'll make you eat a piece." Mr. Holmes shrugged and stopped arguing with his wife. He turned to look at his son. "Sherlock, do you also think it's a messenger from God?" "No," Sherlock said coldly. "It's just an owl that's learned to deliver mail." He spoke while opening the envelope. The reply was remarkably brief. "I will visit before 9 o'clock, Minerva McGonagal." Heh. Sherlock couldn't help but chuckle softly. Interesting. It seemed that fellow had great confidence in the actor he'd hired. Looking at the time, it was now 8:45. In 15 minutes, this person claiming to be Professor McGonagal would be arriving. "Sherlock, what on earth is going on?" Faced with his parents' questions, Sherlock shook his head gently. "That question is better left for our visitor to explain." After all, he was quite curious to see this deputy headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. At exactly 9 o'clock, the front door was knocked on schedule. "Hello, I am Minerva McGonagal, who wrote back to you." A stern-looking woman appeared in front of the Holmes family. 5 minutes later, Professor Minerva McGonagal sat properly with the Holmes family in the living room. McGonagal's first impression of Sherlock was favorable. Sherlock was taller than his peers, which made him appear somewhat thin. While his appearance wasn't the particularly cute type among young boys, his facial features were strong and he looked he would be a handsome man in future. His gray eyes were particularly striking. Besides his eyes, his nose was also quite noticeable. Overall, Sherlock's appearance gave an impression of alertness and decisiveness, fitting McGonagal's ideal of a good student. After brief pleasantries, the no-nonsense McGonagal got straight to the point. Every child born in Britain with magical talent was automatically added to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry's enrollment list. When these children turned 11, they would receive acceptance letters delivered by owl. If the recipient didn't receive the letter, the owls would keep delivering until they did. Besides the acceptance letter, there was also a list of required supplies, including uniforms, textbooks, cauldrons, wands, and other items included in that letter. For children from wizarding families, this was a very routine, ordinary thing. But for some people, they neither knew they possessed magic nor were aware of the magical world's existence. In such cases, Hogwarts would send staff members to visit and explain everything to their guardians, ensuring they received the information. However, Mr. Holmes is the first this year to actively request our visit. When she said this, McGonagal's look of appreciation toward Sherlock grew even stronger. In McGonagal's view, any person with magical talent who didn't receive systematic magical education was wasteful, and could even become a criminal in future. People in the Middle Ages were very afraid of magic. Many wizards, particularly witches, suffered various degrees of persecution, with severe cases even losing their lives. Wizards of that era also lacked a complete educational system, with all wizard children learning magic at home under their parents' guidance. It was under these circumstances that Hogwarts came into being. It now had over 1,000 years of history. Therefore, people like Sherlock Holmes, born into non-magical families, showing such active interest in understanding the magical world was highly commendable. You know, every year during school enrollment, some non-magical families would react to magic with fear and try to avoid it. Please, it was already 1991. Film and television works about magic were all adapted from reality. Why did these people still hold such attitudes toward magic? However, the nearly 60-year-old McGonagal also understood clearly. Prejudice in people's hearts was like a mountain. No matter how hard you try, you cannot move it. Even though magic school teachers repeatedly emphasized that wizards' magical power increased with age. If young wizards reached school age but still didn't learn to control their magical power would become unstable, and in severe cases, they might even lose their lives. Even so, the notion that wizards equal evil still existed in some people's minds. After multiple setbacks, Hogwarts established new rules. If these families, after understanding the truth about the magical world, still refused enrollment, these children could continue staying home and attending regular schools. This amounted to leaving everything to fate and God. Of course, Hogwarts didn't encourage this approach. This was a last resort when all else failed. However, judging from Sherlock's positive attitude, this situation shouldn't arise in this family. While McGonagal was observing Sherlock, he was likewise observing her. In fact, before McGonagal finished explaining about Hogwarts to Sherlock and his parents, Sherlock had already completed his analysis and assessment of McGonagal through observation. The result greatly surprised him. Because according to his judgment, this woman calling herself Professor Minerva McGonagal wasn't lying. From a person's momentary expressions, every muscle movement, and every shift of the eyes, one could deduce their innermost thoughts. For someone trained in observation and analysis, this wasn't difficult. Sherlock was precisely such a person. When his visitor had just sat down before entering the main topic, Sherlock had already deduced her personality from her wrinkle-free dark green robes, neatly arranged curly black hair pulled into a high bun, and the light-reflecting square glasses. Serious, stern, and meticulous. Such people, if they wanted to lie, would be more easily detected than ordinary people. For this reason, Sherlock began to doubt his previous judgment. If McGonagal wasn't lying, didn't that mean this wasn't that person's arrangement? Did magic really exist? When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Sherlock couldn't help murmuring, "Excuse me, Mr. Holmes, what did you just say?" McGonagal looked at Sherlock. She hadn't caught his mumbled words. Sherlock's parents also looked at him curiously. "No, nothing." Sherlock shook his head, then fixed his bright gaze on McGonagal. To prove whether magic truly existed, there was actually a very simple method. "Professor, could you demonstrate magic for us?" Hearing Sherlock's request, Mr. and Mrs. Holmes also looked expectantly at McGonagal. Of course. McGonagal wasn't at all surprised by such a request. If they hadn't made this request, she would have found it strange, mainly because she had so much experience dealing with such situations. "If you agree." After receiving an affirmative answer, McGonagal drew out a black wand and waved it elegantly. Under the surprised gazes of the family of three, the teacup in front of Sherlock transformed into an adorable little squirrel. "Oh my God! Good Lord! Look, what am I seeing? How incredible! The teacup actually became a squirrel." Compared to his dramatically expressive parents, Sherlock was much calmer. Magic tricks, hypnosis, or dexterity of hands. Even at this moment, Sherlock still tried to explain everything happening in front of him from a scientific perspective. Then the little squirrel, transformed from the teacup, shook its head and jumped onto his outstretched palm. Sherlock tentatively petted it. Very soft. The little creature even actively nuzzled against Sherlock's hand, and the fluffy sensation immediately registered. The touch felt real. So, this was real, not a dream. Sherlock looked up at McGonagal and made one final attempt. "Professor, could you change it back?" "Certainly." McGonagal waved her wand again, and the squirrel in Sherlock's hand immediately transformed back into a teacup. The tea was still warm. When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Sherlock spoke these words for the second time. This time he was certain. This world truly had magic. This fantasy that should have belonged to human imagination actually existed. For Sherlock, this was undoubtedly a complete reconstruction of his worldview. However, once he accepted this premise, Sherlock's thinking immediately expanded. The exquisite envelope, the mail-delivering owl, the strange enrollment method, all of these now had reasonable explanations. This time he had truly misjudged that fellow. "Mr. Holmes, are you willing to enroll in our school?" For McGonagal, she was long accustomed to the surprised reactions of young wizards and their guardians upon seeing magic. The key question was whether Sherlock could enroll on time. From his response letter, Sherlock himself should have no problems. Now it depended on his parents' opinion. Noticing McGonagal's gaze directed at him, Mr. Holmes considered briefly and asked, "Professor, does enrollment require boarding at school?" "Father, I think you wouldn't want me to attend school 800 kilometers away in Scotland and still come home every day." "Scotland? Oh, dear Sherlock, that's so far away. Your mother and I wouldn't be able to take care of you." "I can take care of myself." "But—" "Wait. Hold on a moment." The Holmes family looked at McGonagal in confusion. She was staring at Sherlock with an incredulous expression. "Mr. Holmes, did you just mention Scotland?" Sherlock looked at McGonagal calmly. "Yes, Professor." How did you know?" McGonagal was shocked. In this world, most magical schools are situated in rugged mountainous regions. Hogwarts is no exception. However, its specific geographical location is kept secret. Even within the British wizarding world, few people know it. Not to mention that all magical schools are protected by concealment charms. Non-magical people see only ruins or warning signs. Finding the school is virtually impossible. Just 5 minutes ago, the Holmes family didn't even know magic existed. But it was also just now that Sherlock, this young boy from a Muggle family, spoke extraordinary words in a matter-of-fact tone. "Hogwarts is in Scotland." This was simply galloping gorgons. McGonagal made a great effort not to lose her composure. "No what?" Compared to McGonagal, Sherlock appeared very calm, as if he didn't understand why the other person was so surprised. "What you just said means Hogwarts is in Scotland." McGonagal couldn't help but press him. "It's just a simple deduction." Seeing that McGonagal still looked confused, Sherlock sighed and took out the acceptance letter he had received 3 days ago. This paper is thick and sturdy, of particularly good quality, nearly £half for a stack. McGonagal looked at Sherlock with puzzlement, as if asking with her eyes, "So, what?" Sherlock handed the letter to McGonagal. "Professor, please hold it up to the light." McGonagal was puzzled but did as Sherlock requested. Then she saw a capital A and 3 lowercase letters L, B, A interwoven in the paper's texture. McGonagal was stunned. In all these years, Hogwarts had sent countless acceptance letters, but this was the first time she had noticed this detail, naturally not understanding what it meant. "Do you know what this means?" She couldn't help but ask. Of course, Alba, in Gaelic, it means Scotland. This paper was manufactured in Scotland, Sherlock said in a matter-of-fact tone. "But—" Before McGonagal could object, Sherlock was already explaining at breakneck speed. Of course, this alone wouldn't be enough to make the judgment, but add the Scottish owl that delivered the letter, the Scottish tartan pattern on your blouse, and the Scottish accent you unconsciously use when speaking. If these weren't enough to make the determination, That would be rather foolish. Merlin's beard. After Sherlock finished speaking in one breath, McGonagal was thoroughly amazed. What had seemed utterly incredible before now seemed perfectly logical after Sherlock's explanation. This young wizard was truly too surprising. So, when she returned to school, should she consider suggesting that Headmaster Dumbledore strengthen their security measures? After all, deducing Hogwarts' location without magic was far too incredible. Sherlock, are you really going to attend school there? Professor Minerva McGonagal, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry and head of Gryffindor House, had already left. Regarding Sherlock's ability to determine Hogwarts' location based solely on observational clues, Professor McGonagal was deeply impressed, though Sherlock himself found the matter obvious. Because of this incident, the usually stern Professor McGonagal was generous with her praise and expressed considerable expectations for Sherlock's upcoming life at Hogwarts. After this, McGonagal didn't forget to conscientiously fulfill her duties. She told Sherlock that items like wands, robes, and spellbooks, things that seemed to exist only in the magical world, could actually be purchased locally in London, as long as one knew the right places. She could have taken Sherlock directly to Diagon Alley. But as head of Gryffindor and deputy headmistress of Hogwarts, McGonagal was extremely busy, especially during the preterm period. Having discovered that Sherlock's family didn't reject magic and that his parents promised to take Sherlock themselves, she decided to free up her time for families who needed her more. So, she explained everything in detail, including how to travel to Hogwarts by train. Additionally, McGonagal had Sherlock's parents sign a confidentiality agreement on behalf of Hogwarts. They couldn't reveal the existence of magic to anyone except immediate family. For the Holmes couple, this wasn't a problem. They weren't flamboyant by nature. Sherlock, however, seemed to think of something, as his gaze grew increasingly deep. After McGonagal left, Mrs. Holmes already became sentimental and began to hesitate again. According to McGonagal, once Sherlock went to Hogwarts, he would have to live at school, only returning home during Christmas and summer holidays each year. Just this alone was difficult for Mrs. Holmes to accept. Not to mention that this lifestyle would continue until Sherlock graduated in his 7th year. The thought that for the next 7 years, Sherlock would only spend about 2 months at home each year naturally made her, as a mother, unable to accept it. Dear Violet, since it's Sherlock's own decision, we should support him. We always have, haven't we? I understand, but Tarquin, Sherlock is only 11. Trust me, and trust Sherlock. He'll take care of himself. Wizards might not have the best reputation, but Sherlock's safety was more important. The consequences of magical outbursts sounded truly terrifying. Besides, this was Sherlock's own choice. He wasn't an ordinary little boy, after all. Mr. Holmes explained while guiding his wife toward the bedroom, turning back to give Sherlock a reassuring look. Sherlock was naturally reassured. Though his father usually surrendered to his mother in most situations, at crucial moments, he could always successfully persuade her. Indeed, Mr. Holmes didn't disappoint his son. After thorough communication, he ultimately convinced his wife to accept the reality that Sherlock would be spending most of the next 7 years away from them. Next came the preparations for school. Originally, Sherlock had planned to go alone to purchase all the necessary school supplies. But this time, Mrs. Holmes absolutely refused to let him go alone. Plus, shopping required financial support from the family, so father and son had to compromise. The next day, the family of 3 drove out and soon reached Charing Cross. This was a very prosperous area. Located in the city of Westminster, adjacent to the Chelsea district where the Holmes family lived, it was traditionally London's central area and Britain's conventional zero point for road and railway distances. The Holmes family's destination was on this very street. According to McGonagal, they first needed to find the famous Leaky Cauldron, though McGonagal's famous was limited to the wizarding world. Before she mentioned it, neither Sherlock nor the Holmes couple had ever heard of such a place. Originally, Sherlock thought this wouldn't be difficult, but they encountered setbacks from the start. Tarquin, did we get it wrong? Mrs. Holmes looked at the bookstore on the left, then at the record shop on the right. Being in central London, both shops were quite busy. But no matter how she looked, left, right, up, or down, she couldn't see any pub. Mr. Holmes frowned as well. Watching the passing pedestrians, some entering the bookstore, others the record shop, but none looking like they were going to a pub. At this moment, the couple looked at their son in unison. Unlike his parents, Sherlock could see very clearly. There was indeed a pub here. Its location was between the large bookstore and the record shop on the other side, just as McGonagal had said. But if McGonagal hadn't specifically pointed it out, even with Sherlock's meticulous observational skills, he wouldn't have noticed. As for other people, including Mr. and Mrs. Holmes, it went without saying. Just looking at the hurried appearance of passers-by, it was clear they couldn't see the leaky cauldron. This is the magical world's influence on the mundane world, reducing one's presence, making ordinary people unable to see. Sherlock understood in his heart. Indeed, once one touched the magical world, interesting things followed one after another. He responded to his parents with action. Seeing their son walk directly toward the space between the two shops, the couple hurried to follow. When they got close, they finally noticed the pub. Shabby, cramped, dirty, this was the leaky cauldron's first impression. Inside the pub, it remained dimly lit with simple furnishings. Several tables were placed in the shadowy corners, where groups of people were drinking and talking loudly. Everything looked no different from an ordinary pub. But these people were all dressed in bizarre clothing, and their conversation topics were absurd in the extreme. After listening for just a few sentences, Mr. Holmes couldn't help but say to his wife, "Violet, I bet you that ordinary people coming here wouldn't finish their butterbeer before getting up to leave." Mrs. Holmes nodded in agreement. After all, speaking about creating a meteor shower sounded ridiculous no matter how you heard it. Sherlock's gaze swept over each of these people, unconsciously analyzing and categorizing every scene. Smoking woman in the northwest corner, 5 meters away, under 50, married, poor self-control, separated from husband, came to the pub to find young men. Grinning man directly ahead, 7 meters away, early 20s, about to get married, came here to bid farewell to his single life. His friends don't support his decision. Short man at the table diagonally behind, around 35, bad temper, doesn't have enough money to pay for drinks, currently trying to figure out how to skip the bill. Ordinary-looking, burly man passing by. Every person Sherlock observed seemed to automatically deliver this information to his vision. For Sherlock, such things had become instinctive. Man walking toward us, about 40, has been observing everyone entering and leaving the pub. Oh, he's the owner. 2 muggles, 1 young wizard. Classic combination. Another summer blown by the wind has arrived. The man stopped in front of the 3 and began introducing himself directly. "I'm the pub owner, Tom Cruise. You can call me Old Tom. Welcome to the leaky cauldron." Tom Cruise. Looking at his nearly bald head, face wrinkled like a dried walnut, and eyes almost squinted shut, Mr. and Mrs. Holmes' mouths twitched, not knowing what to say. They knew this wasn't polite, but they couldn't control themselves. However, Sherlock wasn't affected. He stepped forward directly to greet him. "Mr. Cruise, Professor McGonagal sent us." After observing and determining Tom's personality, Sherlock directly mentioned McGonagal's name. Of course. Young wizards from Muggle families. Rare but not uncommon. Follow me. While following Tom, Sherlock casually inquired about the people he had observed earlier. As the pub owner, Tom naturally knew their situations. The results pleased Sherlock. His deductions were all correct. It seemed that even coming to the magical world, the deductive method he had summarized from scientific systems hadn't lost its effectiveness. So, when science and magic intersect, the story begins. The ability to see through phenomena to essence, to discover truth in minute details, is certainly a talent. But it must also be forged through continuous practice. Initially, Sherlock started with relatively simple problems. For instance, when meeting a stranger, determining their history and profession through observation. Such training might seem childish and boring, but it could sharpen one's observational abilities. As time passed and practice continued, Sherlock's skills in this area became increasingly proficient. Now he already knew where to observe and what to look for. He had summarized his own deductive method. Though not yet perfect, observation and analysis had become instinctive for him. If he were in a train car, he could even tell the occupations of all fellow passengers through observation. Unfortunately, no one would bet with him, or he would surely make a fortune. While Sherlock questioned the pub owner Tom, the latter led Sherlock and his parents through the bar to a small courtyard surrounded by walls on all sides. Sherlock's gaze quickly swept the surroundings, finding nothing but a trash can and some weeds. So, the problem was with the trash can? Sherlock stepped forward 2 paces, approaching closely. At the same time, Tom made his move. He slowly drew his wand, preparing to do something, when he suddenly turned back to smile at Sherlock, reminding him, "Once you have a wand, you'll need to come in yourselves. Remember this brick's position. It's above the trash can. 3rd brick up, 2nd brick across," Sherlock said calmly. Tom turned to look at Sherlock with surprise. "You? How did you know?" "Because only it was different from the other bricks on the wall, whether in color or the degree of wear around its edges." For someone skilled in observation, discovering this wasn't very difficult. Truly amazing observational ability. Tom, upon hearing Sherlock's explanation, couldn't help but express sincere admiration, then gently tapped the brick 3 times with his wand. The Holmes family stared intently at the brick. Next, something astonishing happened. The tapped brick began to shake. First, a small hole appeared in the center. Then the bricks on both sides moved rapidly, and the opening grew larger and larger. Finally, a wide archway appeared before them. The archway led to a cobblestone street that seemed to go on forever. Compared to the originally dim and cramped Leaky Cauldron, this street appeared exceptionally bright. One could say that their view suddenly opened up completely. "Welcome to Diagon Alley." Tom's voice rang out at just the right moment. This was their destination, Diagon Alley. Sherlock turned around to see the archway narrowing, the wall returning to its original state, and Tom waving goodbye to them. "That short man. He has no money on him. He should be preparing to run now." Sherlock thought for a moment and decided to give a warning. Hearing his words, Tom's face immediately changed, as if remembering something. Without even thanking them, he ran back inside. Then they heard sounds of "Stop! Stop right there! Catch him!" faintly coming from inside the pub. Sherlock shrugged, withdrew his gaze, and walked onto the street with his parents. Diagon Alley formed a stark contrast with the Leaky Cauldron. Bright, wide streets, bustling shops, crowds of people. Even the well-traveled Mr. Holmes couldn't help saying, "To think London would have such a place. It's truly unimaginable." Mrs. Holmes nodded, agreeing with her husband's assessment. Sherlock fell into thought. Since confirming that magic's existence wasn't fake news, the magical world's attraction for him had grown stronger and stronger. Now it seemed that the Leaky Cauldron, Diagon Alley existence was somewhat similar to the mirror worlds of science fiction works. However, the magical world shouldn't exist separate from the mundane world. Presumably, even if the city government didn't know, the Prime Minister and the royal family should be aware. Having such a place would certainly mean much less tax revenue for the city government. Sherlock thought to himself. Following McGonagal's instructions, the 3 first went to Gringotts' Wizarding Bank on the north side of Diagon Alley. They needed to exchange some magical currency. Yes, though somewhat unexpected, the magical world truly had its own monetary system. Gold coins were galleons, 17 silver sickles made 1 galleon, and 29 copper nuts made 1 sickle. This exchange rate inevitably made Sherlock somewhat disdainful of wizards' mathematical abilities. Even if they couldn't arrange it as decimal, they should at least make the exchange rates between the 3 currencies consistent. Though Britain had once had the old system of £1 to 20 shillings, 1 shilling to 12 pence, since the 1971 currency reform abolished shillings, it had long since changed to £1 exchanging for 100 new pence. The mundane world was constantly progressing. Why couldn't the magical world keep up? Regrettable as it was, money still needed to be exchanged. Compared to other buildings in Diagon Alley, Gringotts' Wizarding Bank was quite distinctive. The towering white building made it stand out like a crane among chickens in the surrounding low buildings, and its bronze doors gleamed in the sunlight. However, what attracted people most was the fellow standing at the door in a scarlet and gold uniform. Short in stature, with long arms and legs, a dark face, and a long, pointed beard, that was a goblin. Seeing this scene, Sherlock's eyes lit up, another creature from legend. "Are you here to exchange money? Don't wander around, follow me." Probably recognizing the non-wizard status of the Holmes couple, the goblin immediately guessed the trio's purpose, bowed to them, and spoke. Sherlock noticed the other's distant attitude and rather cold tone. "TSK, Still having such an attitude in the service industry, the magical world really should train them properly. The Holmes parents weren't in the mood to consider this. Mrs. Holmes even looked somewhat worried. "Tarquin, I wonder if the money we brought is enough? Sherlock seems to need quite a lot of things. I wouldn't want him to suffer in such a distant place." "Don't worry, Violet. Trust me, there's no problem," Mr. Holmes quietly reassured her. The Holmes family foundation was quite solid. Sherlock's grandfather was a hereditary country squire. In Victorian times, that would be proper nobility. Even in present-day London, they belonged to the upper tier of the middle class. So as long as the magical world's currency values weren't too outrageous, Mr. Holmes was confident in his family's purchasing power. When following the goblin through the second silver door, the text carved on the 2 doors caught Sherlock's attention. "Enter, stranger, but take heed of what awaits the sin of greed. For those who take, but do not earn, must pay most dearly in their turn. So if you seek beneath our floors a treasure that was never yours, thief, you have been warned, beware of finding more than treasure there." Sherlock lifted his sharp gray eyes from the bronze plaque. It was clear that this wizard bank had great confidence in its security measures, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. How should he put it? Every bank possessed this same misguided certainty, that is, until they encountered their first devastating incident. He had seen it countless times in the Muggle world, and apparently magical institutions were no different in their pride. As Sherlock contemplated this familiar pattern, his gaze swept across the marble hall that stretched like a cathedral. Soaring columns of white stone rose toward a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadow, while the floor beneath reflected their footsteps with mirror-like precision. The grandeur was undeniably impressive, designed to intimidate and inspire awe in equal measure. Yet with just a brief, professional assessment, he had already identified several conspicuous vulnerabilities. The positioning of the goblin guards, the predictable patrol patterns, the obvious blind spots created by the architectural add-ons. Without magic, given one night's time and proper preparation, he could definitely secure this bank a front-page headline: "Shocking! Gringotts funds vanish without a trace. Mysterious figure bypasses centuries-old security and departs with unprecedented ease." This scenario wasn't anything unusual. It bore striking similarities to the notorious financial bond theft case that had rocked the city of London barely a year ago. The Bank of England's response at the time had been textbook institutional denial, following a pattern so predictable it could have been scripted. Stage 1, vehemently claim nothing had happened, dismissing all reports as groundless rumors. Stage 2, grudgingly admit that perhaps something might have occurred, but insist that no action was necessary. Stage 3, concede that perhaps some action should be taken, but maintain that nothing effective could be done. Stage 4, finally acknowledge that perhaps something could have been accomplished back then, but now it was regrettably too late. The Wizard Bank would undoubtedly follow this same path to perfection when their inevitable crisis arrived. However, Sherlock now knew that magic existed in this strange new world, real, tangible magic. Before fully understanding this alien concept and its consequences, it would be the height of foolishness to act rashly. When they finally reached the imposing marble counter, an available goblin was summoned by their earlier guide to handle the currency exchange for the 3 members of the Holmes family. The exchange rate between galleons and British pounds wasn't fixed, a fact that struck Sherlock as remarkably sophisticated for what he had initially assumed was a primitive magical economy. Today's rate stood at 1:5, with each golden galleon worth £5 sterling. This revelation was genuinely surprising, causing Sherlock to reassess his understanding of the magical world's economic power. After all, this was 1991, and the pound sterling remained one of the world's strongest currencies. Under these circumstances, for magical galleons to be valued at 5 times the pound was not just impressive, it was economically staggering. Fortunately, the primary concern that had kept Mrs. Holmes worried didn't happen. Her maternal anxiety about providing adequately for her son's magical education had driven her to pack what she considered a substantial sum. They had brought more than enough money, sufficient to exchange for nearly 1,000 galleons, which should cover any reasonable educational expense. However, just as they were preparing to complete the substantial exchange, an entirely unexpected complication raised its bureaucratic head. There was actually a strict limit on exchanging pounds for magical world currency. Upon learning this startling news, Sherlock experienced a moment of genuine surprise, a rare occurrence for someone who prided himself on anticipating every possibility. However, his mind quickly processed and accepted this restriction. In the non-magical world, similar currency exchange limitations existed in most developed nations. These restrictions served primarily to prevent excessive and potentially destabilizing capital flows that could wreak havoc on national economies. Excessive capital movement, particularly large amounts of volatile short-term investment capital, always caused severe and unpredictable fluctuations in financial markets. The consequences could ripple through entire economic systems like dominoes falling in precisely choreographed destruction. This was especially dangerous under specific economic conditions, such as periods of economic downturn, increased market volatility, or international political instability. Without proper foreign exchange management constraints firmly in place, such conditions inevitably led to large-scale capital flight as investors panicked and sought safer havens for their wealth. This capital migration would subsequently trigger domestic currency devaluation, widespread financial market chaos, and a series of other economic problems that could destroy decades of careful fiscal policy. In the most severe cases, these factors could combine to trigger a full-scale financial crisis. Therefore, for the perfectly reasonable goals of maintaining adequate foreign exchange reserves, protecting domestic economic stability, and preserving financial market order, most countries impose strict annual limits on the amount of foreign currency that ordinary citizens could legally exchange each year. Once this carefully calculated limit was exceeded, no additional foreign currency could be obtained until the following calendar year. Since the magical world maintained its own completely independent monetary system, separate from and parallel to the mundane economy, it was entirely logical and understandable that similar limits would exist on exchanging magical currency. Like hell, it was logical. If these restrictions applied equally to everyone, that approach would still maintain some semblance of fairness and reason. However, according to the goblin's matter-of-fact explanation, delivered with a casual indifference, wizards from non-magical families faced a maximum annual exchange limit of precisely 128 galleons. No more, no less, regardless of their actual financial needs or circumstances. As for the exchange limit imposed on families of pure magical heritage, though the goblin refrained from stating specific numbers, Sherlock's keen observational skills allowed him to draw obvious conclusions from watching other transactions. The amounts being exchanged by obvious wizard families far exceeded 128 galleons, by factors of 10 or perhaps more. He could even boldly assume that established wizard families faced no meaningful restrictions whatsoever on exchanging galleons, enjoying unlimited access to magical currency conversion. What else could he say about this blatant disparity? It was simply the age-old practice of systematic discriminatory treatment, dressed up in the polite language of financial regulation but serving the same exclusionary purpose as any other form of institutional prejudice. However, Sherlock's meticulous observational skills allowed him to discover alternative pathways hidden within the bank's other business forms scattered across the counter. The 128 galleon limitation appeared to apply specifically and exclusively to direct pound-to-galleon currency exchange transactions. Intrigued by this potential loophole, he asked another question to the increasingly impatient goblin. Sure enough, as he had suspected, Gringotts also maintained a thriving business in purchasing gold, precious jewelry, rare antiques, and other valuable commodities at current market rates. This crucial information meant that while British pounds could only be exchanged for a maximum of 128 galleons annually, valuable physical items like gold ingots, diamond jewelry, or priceless artifacts could potentially be converted into significantly larger amounts of magical currency. Sherlock's eyes immediately brightened with the unmistakable gleam of discovery. He suddenly realized he had stumbled upon a previously unknown and potentially revolutionary money laundering route that could serve London's more enterprising criminals, a magical sanctuary for financial crimes that existed completely outside the jurisdiction of mundane law enforcement. The only prerequisite was successfully gaining access to this hidden magical district. Although the questioned goblin's patience had clearly reached its limits, Sherlock's persistent questioning eventually extracted one additional piece of valuable information. The 128 galleon annual limit was actually more than sufficient to purchase everything a new wizard student required for their complete magical education. The goblin emphasized this point with the weary air of someone who had repeated this explanation countless times to concerned parents. After all, beyond these initial supply purchases, attending Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry represented pure compulsory education, complete room and board included, with absolutely no additional tuition fees required throughout the student's entire 7-year magical education. This educational approach was remarkably consistent with policies in the non-magical world. In Britain, all students received guaranteed compulsory education from age 5, when they first entered kindergarten, until age 17, when they completed their secondary education as young adults. During this crucial 12-year developmental period, all eligible children were legally required to attend school, and every parent bore the legal responsibility of ensuring their children received proper education. These students enjoyed completely free national educational welfare, with the state accepting full financial responsibility for all necessary tuition costs, required textbooks, and essential school supplies. Age 11 represented precisely the traditional stage of finishing primary school and transitioning into secondary education, making Hogwarts' timing perfectly aligned with established educational progression. Therefore, aside from this single substantial shopping expedition before each academic year began, no additional educational expenses should theoretically be required throughout the student's magical schooling. Finally, after paying exactly £640 sterling to exchange for the maximum allowable number of galleons, Sherlock and his parents left Gringotts. For a long time after leaving Gringotts, Mrs. Holmes remained somewhat dejected. She appeared deeply influenced by the timeless philosophy of big in town, beggar at home, the fear that her family's comfortable middle-class status in London society would be inadequate in this new magical world. This concern had even prompted her to begin seriously considering whether they should return home immediately, gather all their valuable gold jewelry and family heirlooms, and bring these treasures back to exchange for additional galleons, ensuring her beloved son wouldn't suffer financial hardship during his education in distant Scotland. Sherlock, recognizing his mother's escalating anxiety and understanding its source, promptly intervened to halt this increasingly frantic line of thinking. Let's do our shopping first. If our current funds are insufficient for the required purchases, then we can consider using those methods. Mrs. Holmes, somewhat reassured by her son's practical approach, agreed to follow Sherlock's sensible suggestion. The next phase of their magical adventure involved the actual shopping expedition through the cobblestone streets of Diagon Alley. According to the detailed school supply list requirements provided by Hogwarts, Sherlock purchased an impressive collection of textbooks with titles like The Standard Book of Spells and A History of Magic, along with essential equipment including pewter cauldrons of varying sizes, precision brass scales for measuring potion ingredients, telescopes for astronomical observations, and numerous other specialized items required for magical coursework. At this point in their shopping expedition, Sherlock made the discovery that the Gringotts goblins' earlier reassurances had been somewhat misleading, if not outright deceptive. The assertion that 128 galleons provided more than enough for purchasing all items on the school supply list could only be charitably described as barely adequate, and definitely not more than enough, as originally claimed. Judging from the steadily climbing prices of items they had already purchased, the financial reality was becoming increasingly clear. 3 sets of plain workrobes cost 20 galleons, a single telescope cost 10 galleons, and even a simple quill pen for everyday writing cost 1 full galleon, prices that seemed inflated even by London's expensive standards. Most outrageous of all was the discovery that a single brand-new textbook actually cost 9 galleons, nearly 10% of their entire annual currency exchange allowance for one book. Was knowledge in the magical world truly this extraordinarily expensive, or were magical families simply accustomed to paying premium prices that would shock mundane sensibilities? This disturbing revelation made the already distressed Mrs. Holmes even more visibly upset. For this deeply personal reason, she firmly and uncompromisingly vetoed Sherlock's entirely practical suggestion of purchasing second-hand textbooks from a nearby shop that advertised quality used books at reasonable prices. Sherlock couldn't help but feel somewhat helpless and frustrated about this maternal interference in what he considered a purely logical financial decision. He was, by nature, a thoroughly practical pragmatist who approached every situation with calculated efficiency. In his analytical view, second-hand textbooks offered identical educational content to new textbooks. The words, spells, and knowledge remained completely unchanged regardless of previous ownership. Yet their price was merely 1/3 of new books, making them an obviously superior financial choice. This represented practically highway robbery in reverse, a steal that any rational person would immediately recognize and embrace. If he were making this decision by himself, based purely on logical financial analysis, he would definitely choose second-hand textbooks without hesitation. Unfortunately, his dear mother's emotional investment in her son's magical education wouldn't permit such practical considerations to override her desire to provide him with the finest possible materials. Besides the specifically required items listed on the official Hogwarts supply list, Sherlock also made several additional strategic purchases designed to enhance his understanding of this fascinating new world. For example, He bought Important Magical Events of the 20th Century and The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts, which could help him further understand the magical world. Most intriguingly, he discovered a best-selling work by an author named Bear Grylls, Survival Guide for Extreme Situations.